All right, radios for airsoft. First things first, I'm not a licensed ham radio operator. I don't have a GMRS license, and everything I say is going to be specifically catered for airsoft. So if you are really into ham radios, that's great. I will get things wrong. Go ahead and correct me down in the comments if you stick around. But this is my experience and kind of an intro for airsofters into ham radios so you can understand some of the terminology, understand what different types of radios there are. This is not going to be about radio etiquette. This is not going to be about how to set up your gear on your plate carrier or whatever else like that. So, first things first, there are two main types of radios for airsoft. Yes, there are a bunch of different models, but two main types. One is going to be analog, one is going to be digital. Okay, so what is the difference between analog and digital? Analog is cheaper. That's the main benefit. It's cheaper and it's easier to set up. So if you had to buy 10 of them, it's a lot easier to do that with analog. But comparatively, they're not great. Now, one of the main things that digital has over analog is range and clarity. Okay, and when I say range, technically speaking, these are two 10-watt radios. The signal will go as far if they're both at actually 10 watts, right? Something to keep in mind with radios in general is that they don't always transmit what they advertise. Okay. But range and clarity. And what I mean by range is usable range. Okay. So it doesn't matter if your radio transmissions are getting out 20 miles if they're so garbled on the other end that they don't matter. Okay. So basically, you have to bear with my atrocious handwriting. Okay. Basically, you have analog, which the further away in distance, the further away, the lower the clarity. You have digital, which the further away doesn't really matter until you hit a drop-off point, right? Because this is sending your words over the airwaves, and this is sending ones and zeros, basically. And yes, I'm dumbing things down. Like I said, if anyone knows better, feel free to put it in the comments, but I'm trying to simplify things, right? So this guy is like sending a voice message, right? If you've ever sent a voice message on Facebook or any other app on your phone, you know that it just takes the sound you recorded, transmits to another phone, and then that downloads on their end and they get to listen to it, and it should sound about the same as how you recorded it. Okay, now obviously there's a limitation of distance compared to a cell phone, but the usable range is going to be better than the analog. And analog is more like trying to shout at someone. The further you are away from that person, the less they're going to be able to hear. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind between the two. Now, like I said, there's a big difference in cost, right? You can buy over about 8 of these for the price of one of these. So that's something to keep in mind. And even if you're going with something a little bit better, you can buy 2 of these for the price of one of these. So is it right for you? That's up to you. Okay. So those are the two main types of radios. Now, something to keep in mind is if you transmit on digital and someone else happens to be on that same frequency and they happen to pick up on your digital transmission, it's not like you can't hear it, but it's going to sound like a dial-up modem, if you're old enough to remember those. Okay. So, is it encrypted? No. You cannot legally send encrypted messages, kinda. There are radios that get around that. There are frequencies that get around that, but that's beyond the purview of this information. But keep in mind, you can hear it. Now, what you're more likely going to hear is just very loud static. So, my experience running a digital and an analog at Copperhead last year was that anytime that I keyed up with the digital, all of the analogs around me, including the other one on my chest, which I was running digital and analog, okay, analog for team, digital for command. Anytime I keyed up, anyone within about 20 feet of me, their analog radios just static, loud static, okay. So that is something to keep in mind, that if you have a cheaper analog like most Baofangs, that's something to keep in mind, is it might blow out other radios nearby. Okay, so, but for clarity and effective range, can't really beat digital. Now, let's talk about wattage real quick. Okay, so wattage will vary. A basic UV5R, the original version, not the 8 watt or whatever else you found, tri-band, whatever. Which, quick note on that, dual band is you can have two little frequencies on there. Let's see when it powers up. Okay, two frequencies. Mine are set to um, VFO mode. I grab a different one real quick. Okay, I'm picking up static, but mine are set to VFO. So dual band, tri-band you would see three frequencies there. Okay, even the basic UV5R can listen to two. So on the note of wattage, okay, your advertised wattage is always going to be higher than what you're actually going to get out of the radio. Maybe not with the super high end, but if you're buying a super high end radio, you already probably know everything I'm about to say. So, this one, for instance, is advertised as a 10 watt radio. Now, does this get better range than the UV5Rs? Yes, even though I have a 8 watt, this gets better range. But does it actually produce 10 watts? No. It gets close. Some testing I've seen gets it out to, just under 9 watts. That's great. This is probably going to be, even though this is an 8 watt, it's probably going to be closer to 5 watts. Something to keep in mind is the frequency you're on will change your power output. Okay, so if I am at 9 watts at 456 megahertz, great. If I then turn it to 135 megahertz, I'm probably going to get a big change in wattage. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, you have to keep in mind that the 10 watts or 8 watts or 10 watts or 25 watts, whatever it is, changes depending on your test setup, your frequency, how much your battery is charged. Everything goes into effect. So when they say 10 watts, the manufacturer is probably under best conditions at the right frequency. You can get 10 watts if you round up. So just keep that in mind when you're buying them. Now, with that being said, something to think about is what wattage you want. Okay, so for instance, you have 8 watts here. Your normal UV5R is 5 watts. Your AR152 is 10 watts. Lexan Note 25 watts. It's digital guy right here, 10 watts. So what wattage do you want? And that's really going to depend, in my opinion, about what's your role. Okay, I recommend to anyone in a leadership position, anyone who has to transmit over distance, you're going to want as many watts as you can put out. And there is some question about safety with higher wattage and all of that. That's for a scientist to explain. I'm telling you my experience using them. Okay, so for instance, like this is a 25 watt. Is this a bit overkill? Maybe, but It's a 25 watt and it will outrange in transmission the 10 watts, and definitely the 5 watts. Okay. Now that does also come with a price, $1. Two, lower battery life. Three, if you put the antenna near your eyeball, it might feel a little bit weird. So keep that in mind. Again, not a doctor, not giving advice on that, but comes with a price. So if you are in leadership, or if you're on recon, or if you're just going to be separated from whoever you're trying to talk to over a good distance, you might consider going with higher wattage. For instance, this is a 10 watt digital. I've been recommending to all of our guys who are maybe not in leadership position or on recon or whatever, just go with the 5 watt. It's about half the price, if not significantly less. Not a 5 watt analog, but 5 watt digital. So those are things to keep in mind, but basically speaking, the more wattage you have, all else being equal, the further you're going to be able to transmit. Okay. Now, problem there is if I have 10 watts speaking to a 5 watt, I might be at the edge of where this guy can transmit and this guy cannot talk back to the 10 watt. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind. If you're in range for the 5 watt to talk to the 10 watt, great, but the 10 watt might be out of range and the 5 watt can still hear him. Receiving is more about the power that you're receiving rather than transmitting. So you could have a 1 watt radio that gets just as good as reception as a 10 watt radio for just listening, but then has no power to transmit. So keep that in mind with wattage. I think that's about it for wattage. Okay. And again, digital is going to be clearer. Oh, one more thing on wattage to keep in mind is that if you are going over from, let's say, a 10 watt to a 10 watt, then you should expect a decent increase in, obviously, clarity, but also distance. However, if you're going from a, let's say, a 10 watt to a 5 watt digital, you might not get the distance out of it because it's still not pushing out the sound waves as far, right? Or the radio waves as far. So something to keep in mind when you're talking simplex is that the 10 watt analog might outrange the 5 watt digital. And yes, I keep holding up a UV5R for any time I say 5 watt, but yeah, so those are some things to keep in mind for the radios themselves. Now talking about antennas, and this is where things get a little tricky, okay? Not all antennas are created equal. For instance, these two antennas are not the same, right? Yeah, this one I pulled off of a 915 megahertz Mesh-tastic device, but they do make small antennas. They're, generally 8th wave, or they've got some sort of coil in there. My recommendation is stay away from pretty much all of those. Also, so this one actually came with my digital, but stand in for rubber duckies. Okay, these are what's called a rubber ducky antenna. I don't recommend them unless you're buying from a good brand. Like, for instance, this one, actually not too bad. That came with this radio. The ones that come with your UV5Rs are universally garbage unless you're getting an aftermarket with them. Something to keep in mind. Okay. Then you have the next most common for airsoft, especially milsim, is going to be something like these. Okay. Now these are 48-inch, but you get the idea with various types. Now, if you are on the 4.5 or 4.660 to 4.80 frequencies, make sure you're getting a GMRS antenna. These ones are realistically better at 430-ish, not at GMRS band, and a lot of places use, especially big events, use GMRS band. But these are great for pretty much one reason, and that is you can unfold them, and they are absurdly long. So if you need to stick it out of a window or up above a roof or something like that, that's really where these are going to come in best use. Something to keep in mind with these is the more you fold them, or how you fold them differently, that's going to affect how you transmit on different frequencies, right? Now, a benefit to these is they're pretty much always grounded because they're going to be attached to you in some way. But if I fold it 4 times like this, which is how I normally carry them, they're not going to transmit the same as if I were to fold it 2 times or 1 time. And yes, the lengths do technically matter, but inside of here, you have a coil. Now that coil has solder connecting to various parts. There's a video on YouTube where a guy cuts his apart. I'm not going to do that. These aren't super expensive, but they're expensive enough for me to not want to cut apart. But that coil is soldered at different parts, and that's what gives it its frequency range. It's a way of electronically shortening an antenna, or lengthening because you have a coil, right? It's just like you see the CB antennas driving down the road on the semis, and they have a length of wire, a coil, and then a length of wire. Or most people's car antennas, they have a wrap of wire going around them. It's a way of electronically lengthening your antenna without actually lengthening your antenna. So the next most common is you're going to have ones like these. These are generally called whip antennas. My cat's coming to say hello. I'm going to try and knock things over, I'm sure. These you'll also see as like tactical whip or folding whip or something like that. So just keep that in mind. One thing of note with these is it is generally 2 radiating elements that are essentially like tape measures, if not actually tape measures. Some of the cheaper manufacturers actually use old tape measures. Whereas these, and let me grab a short one because it's easier to manage. These and these are whip antennas, right? Now these I make myself. These are from a Brie, not this one specifically. This one actually came with my note, and it handles 25 watts. But these are from a Brie, and these are for GMRS frequencies. Make sure if you're getting a Nagoya or an Abri or whatever, make sure 1, it's genuine, 2, it's for the right frequencies. And that goes for pretty much any antennas. Make sure they are the right frequencies. Okay. And you might not think that the difference between 430 and 465 matter, but they do. Okay. Trust me, I have enough antennas to know the difference. So again, Brie antennas, they're not bad for GMRS. Nice part about these is they are flexible. They are not as flexible as like signal stick, but they are flexible. You can kind of weave them through MOLLE and all that. One thing to keep in mind is that anytime you touch, or your body touches, or maybe gear or a piece of metal or something like that, anytime you come in contact with this, it is going to change how the radio performs. Antennas are realistically meant to be mounted away from the body. It's one of the reasons, assumably, I wasn't JTAC, but it's one of the reasons, assumably, that you see JTAC with their antennas off of their body, because it does change how it transmits, and we'll get to that later. But these have some advantages. They are flexible, which is nice. Um, I had a one of these big 48-inch guys on my AR-152 when I went down to a Third Coast airsoft game in Texas, and running through some trees. I generally have my radio somewhere on my chest. Running through some trees, it knocked it off and broke the antenna. Whereas something like this, as you're running through, it's just going to flop around, or you can weave it through your gear. Yeah, so that's a consideration. Now, those are the most common types you'll see in airsoft. If you're buying a grounded plane antenna or something like that, or you're making one, you're probably not the right audience for this video. You'll also see them on cables, right? This is a antenna relocation kit. So one end goes into your radio, the other end goes into your antenna, and it allows you to relocate it. You know, you can run it on your back, you can run it on your chest. I would recommend whatever antennas you're using and whatever setup you are using, try and get it up away from your body. That's something to keep in mind. So, and then, okay. So, and then what length antenna? So most, like I was saying, most antenna manufacturers will have a coil and they'll shorten it or lengthen it. Okay, but it does kind of matter what length you're using. The shorter the antenna, for instance, these are both for the same frequency. Yep. This is a fourth wave antenna. This is a full wave antenna. And what that means, you'll see fourth or 5/8 or stuff like that. Okay. What that means is your radio wave, just like you learned in high school or whatever with microwaves. Microwave sends out a projected wave. Radio waves are the same thing. Okay. So your radio wave will transmit off of your antenna. Now, full wave projects two beams, or two waves, right? One generally down, one generally up. Okay. Then you have like your 5/8, which is this guy over here should be, yep. Okay, 5/8 will generate a one wave and then a half wave. That half wave goes down, the other wave goes up and away. Okay, or at least to the side. Okay, then you have half wave, and you can look all this up online. I'll get to some diagrams in a second. Half wave, generally, it looks like a bow with the radio wave, and that gets transmitted out just to the side. And then quarter wave is, you get something like this, so it's missing the bottom. Realistically, you want that bottom. And so the reason that these can transmit well, even though they don't have a full wave, is because I'm making the ground. Now, one of the problems with that is when we're playing airsoft, we're not generally holding the radio. It's generally in a pouch somewhere, right? So you can get around not having that second half or not having the grounding either by holding it, or if you're out on the field and you're trying to get a hold of someone and it's not coming through right, you can grab the base of the antenna, and that should help ground out your projected radio wave. Okay. So you can also use these if you're mostly doing CQB or something like that. If you're close quarters, the radio antennas are all kind of the same. If you're all within the same building or maybe car parking lot distance away, like most paintball or airsoft fields, it's fine. You can get away with a little stubby guy. But that is something to keep in mind, that most radio antennas for handhelds, they are going to be quarter wave, and realistically, that doesn't work as well for us because it's not grounded. We're not holding it. It goes in a pouch. We're using a headset or something like that. So it's not a great option for airsoft. One thing to also keep in mind is longer antennas are, in fact, longer. Okay, so the longer your antenna, the more cumbersome it can be. Okay, so there's a reason that these guys stay folded up most of the time, and unless you really need to get a hold of someone, you're not unfolding them. Okay. Now, one advantage to these guys, now this guy is flexible, it'll spring back. These ones I make myself are not flexible. Or they are flexible, they don't spring back. You also want to know what kind of material your antennas are made out of. Copper is best, and it goes down from there. Well, silver is best, but copper is the best that is actually used. But you also got to think that anytime I fold this, that changes how the frequency is portrayed, right? So if I have this, let's say on my back on a plate carrier, and it's on like a U, okay, well, my radio waves are going to be cut in half, and maybe they're projecting in a V pattern, and it's going to mess up whatever I'm trying to do with that radio. There are radios antennas that are meant for that, but not very many. But if you're close quarters, which is generally when you would be doing that, if you are doing close quarters work, again, doesn't really matter. And a full wave might be better than like a quarter wave just sticking up, right? So keep that in mind with wearable antennas. If you're not doing CQB, I wouldn't recommend them. If you are doing CQB, or maybe you're on a squad and you have a designated radio operator who is running a full length or a grounded or like a better antenna, just keep that in mind. Then you might be fine with using a wearable antenna, but just keep that in mind when you're looking at antennas. So now we're going to nerd out a bit on the lengths of antennas. Okay, so what we have here on all of these is going to be your free space. So what it would look like with nothing around it. Okay. What it would look like with nothing around it. The middle one is what it would look like on perfect ground if you set your radio on the ground on perfect ground. And the bottom one is what it would look like if you're at about 1.5 meters, so about chest height. Okay, so something to keep in mind when you're getting antennas is your pattern that you're going to be pushing out. So this is a full wave. Now, if you look at this handy dandy pointer, if you look over here, then you'll notice that it comes up pretty high. And as I go through the other antennas, okay, so like a quarter wave doesn't. You got these nice little arches, right? So now this is a mess, though. So that's something to keep in mind, is how high is your antenna? What's it doing over that ground? So like I said, this is on a 1.5 meter raised vertically, so about chest height. And this is kind of what it would look like even over perfect ground. This is perfect ground. This is in free space. Then you have your this is 3/4, or sorry, let's go to 1/2. This is a half wave. Looks about the same over ground, though. You notice these arches are smaller or shorter. Reason being is that it's not bouncing it off the ground as much, right? The half wave is projecting almost straight out, or in theory straight out. So then you have your 3/4 wave. Now, I'm not going in order. This is just the order that my tablet saved them in. So if you notice, in free space, it gets this nice big arc. Now, that means that it won't transmit in horizontal space as far as those half waves or quarter waves, right? But what you are getting is more vertical distance. Now, that is going to matter for two reasons. One, let's say there's a house right here, okay? If there's a house right there, then that vertical distance, or the vertical distance on perfect on the ground, perfect ground on the ground. Okay, this might clear a house. This might clear a building. It might, if your buddy is standing on a hill, it might be better at reaching him. Whereas it's not as good at horizontal distance, right? Okay, and again, perfect ground, not sitting on the ground is kind of a mess, but you still get a bit of that radiating pattern. And the problem is you're getting more bouncing off the ground and doing weird stuff. Okay, now this one is 3/8. Okay, again, looking at this, we're seeing that it's kind of a happy medium. It's almost like the half wave. It's pretty close. Shouldn't be a surprise. It's mathematically pretty close. You are getting a little bit more vertical distance off of this, but you're getting that same kind of good horizontal distance. Okay. Yeah. And then you have your 5/8. Okay. You have your 5/8, and now we're starting to notice, just like on your, what was that? 3/4, you got that vertical distance, but you're losing out on your horizontal distance over here. Okay, so this one has less of the vertical lobe, but is doing better at that horizontal distance. Okay, so this might be a good trade-off, especially if you're kind of more open ground, right? Where you still might need to get up and over a building, or you might need to get up and over some trees, but you're mostly worried about being able to just push it out horizontally as much as possible. Okay, and then you have your 7/8. Now this is maybe better suited if you are only in a suburb type area, something like Victorville in California. That Lion Claws and Milsim West and them, all them do. Maybe if you're at like the Guardian Center, this might be better, where you can still get up and over buildings, but you're mostly worried about that vertical. Okay, if you're at like Victorville or something like that, where you're dealing with a ton of buildings, you might look at something like this. Are you going to transmit as far? No, but you're going to be able to clear buildings. So maybe if you're just a platoon member, you're not actually an RTO, maybe that's something to look at. You can get up and over buildings a little bit easier. And you're still going to transmit, just not very far horizontally. Of course, all of this isn't a perfect world, so keep that in mind. Then you have your full length antennas, which you got these nice lobes. And then if you notice here, okay, again, you're clearing buildings, maybe. You're not clearing buildings as well. And you're not going to be transmitting horizontally very well. So, what does all that mean? Okay. Because obviously that was a bit of me nerding out. What does all that mean? Okay. It means that there are different trade-offs to each radio antenna you're going to be using. If you're going to be using a full-length antenna, well, that might be better suited for a very wooded area, maybe if you're using a quarter wave antenna, something like that, um, it might be really good for if you're on a hilltop. Maybe if you're really hilly terrain, you want to go with a different antenna. But if you're on a hilltop specifically, a quarter wave should just do fine, right? Because it's transmitting all directions horizontally. People below you are going to pick up on that. Now, if you wanted to get to a hilltop, maybe you go with something a little bit longer or with a different radiating pattern that will get you a higher transmission. Okay. So just keep that in mind. Some antennas are better suited for use in suburban areas. Some are better suited for wide open areas. If you're an RTO and you're not really in buildings as much and you're just concerned about being able to project it as far as possible, maybe you're going to have to step into that street to do it to get line of sight, but maybe like the half wave antenna might be good for that. Okay. So different considerations with antennas. Another consideration I forgot to mention earlier is make sure if you do get into the higher watt radios, like 20 plus, make sure you get an antenna that can handle that. Let's see. And then something to remember as well is that if you're going to be in a vehicle trying to transmit, or you are going to be primarily in buildings, those are different considerations, right? If you're in a vehicle, maybe get something either on a SMA cable or an extension cable or whatever you want to call these, relocation kit, that you can hang out the window. Okay. Or if you are a vehicle driver, you're probably going to want to get something mag mounted or permanently affixed to the outside of the vehicle. Those have different operating principles. Just like I was talking about the quarter wave not having a ground, well, on vehicle mounted antennas, your vehicle acts like a ground. But if you need to use a normal handheld antenna, stick it out the window, take a few steps away from the car, or whatever you need to do. If you're using a wearable antenna, don't put anything over the top of it. So if you have a Camelback on top of a plate carrier, don't put it on the plate carrier and then put your Camelback over the top. Put it on the Camelback. Try and get your antennas up and away from your body. And then I recommend not using the UV5Rs. Just save your money. If that's all you can get into your local field or something, sure. If you're going to a big milsim, everyone's going to be queuing these up. Everyone's going to have one. They're all going to be stepping on each other. It's not going to be a good time, and you're going to walk away thinking radios in airsoft are a load of crap. Okay. This would realistically be the minimum I would recommend to people. 10 watts, good battery life. AR152. With that, though, keep in mind there are better radios out there. Just for the price, it's a pretty good one, and it looks kind of cool. I don't really recommend it. Most people are going to 25 watts. If you're getting a 25 watt, you probably know your reasons why. I don't recommend most people get a 25 watt. I recommend, though, if you can afford it, and if your team can afford it, whoever you're playing with has them or can get them, get a digital radio, okay? You're going to have to set it up to a certain frequency and call or color tone and talk group and all of that. Learn how to use them, and you'll be better off with that. But at the end of the day, learn how to use your radio. Even if it is a UV5R, learn how to program it, do some research, and if you have a UV5R right now, do the research. figure out what settings you need to adjust to get more clarity, or maybe you got to put it on high, or maybe figuring out what antennas you want. Do your research, and hopefully this video was kind of a stepping stone towards that.